The summer heat in rural Montana had become unbearable. For Marcus Holloway, a 52-year-old homesteader living 15 miles outside of Billings, the scorching temperatures weren't just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. His small timber cabin, built by his own hands 20 years ago, had always been his sanctuary. But lately, it felt more like an oven. Marcus wiped the sweat from his brow as he sat on his porch at dawn, watching the sun rise over the Beartooth Mountains. Even at 6 in the morning, the thermometer already read 78 degrees. By noon, it would climb past 105. Inside the cabin, it was worse. Yesterday, his indoor thermometer had hit 94 degrees, and he'd spent the night on the porch, unable to sleep in his own bed. He wasn't wealthy. Far from it. After losing his job as a construction foreman in Seattle 8 years ago, Marcus had used his savings to buy this land and start over. He grew vegetables, raised chickens, and lived simply. Air conditioning wasn't an option. His solar panel setup could barely power his lights and refrigerator. Running an AC unit would drain his entire system in hours. His daughter, Sarah, called him every week from Portland, begging him to move closer to civilization. "You're getting older, Dad. What if something happens?" But Marcus was stubborn. This land was his dream. He'd built everything with his own hands, the cabin, the chicken coop, the vegetable garden that stretched behind the house. Leaving felt like admitting defeat. Still, the heat was winning. His tomatoes were withering despite constant watering. His chickens had stopped laying eggs, huddling in whatever shade they could find. And Marcus himself felt constantly dizzy, struggling to work outside for more than an hour at a time. One afternoon, while organizing tools in his cluttered shed, Marcus found an old journal he'd kept during the cabin's construction. He flipped through pages of sketches and notes, remembering the excitement he'd felt designing every detail. Then he stopped on a page labeled, "Attic Ventilation Plan." He'd almost forgotten. When building the cabin, he'd intentionally left gaps in the attic, small openings between the roof joists that he'd never sealed. At the time, it seemed like smart design for airflow. But over the years, he'd listened to too many people call it sloppy work. His neighbor, Bill Henderson, a retired contractor, had laughed at those gaps during a visit 5 years ago. "You've got holes in your attic, Marcus. That's just poor craftsmanship. You're letting all your heat escape in winter." Embarrassed, Marcus had planned to seal them. He'd bought caulk and insulation foam, even watched YouTube tutorials. But somehow he never got around to it. Other projects always took priority. Eventually, he stopped thinking about those gaps altogether, accepting them as one of his many building mistakes. But now, staring at his old journal, something clicked. Marcus walked outside and circled his cabin slowly, studying the roofline. Then he climbed his ladder and peered into the attic through the access hatch. Hot air rushed past his face, but it was moving, flowing, not trapped. He descended the ladder and stood in his living room, thinking. The cabin's interior was hot, yes, but was it as hot as it should be? He'd visited Bill Henderson's house last summer, a professionally built home with perfect insulation and sealed attics. Bill had complained constantly about the indoor heat, running fans in every room. Marcus grabbed his thermometer and drove his pickup truck to Bill's house, 3 miles down the dirt road. Bill was hosing down his porch, his face red and dripping with sweat. "Hey Bill," Marcus called out. "Mind if I check something inside?" Bill waved him in, grateful for any distraction from the heat. Marcus walked through the house, noting every detail. Bill's living room thermometer read 96 degrees. His bedroom was even worse, 98 degrees. Bill's house was bigger, sure, but it had better insulation, newer windows, and professionally installed roofing. Back at his own cabin, Marcus checked his thermometer again. 87 degrees. Still hot, but 9 degrees cooler than Bill's house. That was significant. That was the difference between miserable and barely tolerable. For the first time in months, Marcus felt something other than defeat. He felt curious. Could those useless gaps, those mistakes everyone mocked, actually be helping? He spent the rest of the evening researching on his phone, his weak internet connection frustrating him as pages loaded slowly. He read about passive cooling, thermal dynamics, and traditional building techniques used before air conditioning existed. And slowly a picture emerged. Those gaps weren't mistakes. They were accidental genius. Marcus sat on his porch that night, journal open on his lap, and smiled for the first time in weeks. Maybe he wasn't a failure. Maybe he'd stumbled onto something valuable without even realizing it. But he needed to be sure. He needed to test it properly. Tomorrow, he decided, the real experiment would begin. Marcus woke up determined. He spent the morning taking detailed measurements, documenting temperatures in different parts of the cabin every hour. He crawled back into the attic with a flashlight, examining those gaps more carefully. They were roughly 2 inches wide, positioned along the northern and southern roof edges, creating a pathway for air to enter low and exit high. But his excitement was short-lived. By afternoon, doubt crept back in. What if he was wrong? What if this was just wishful thinking from a desperate man trying to justify his mistakes? The real blow came 3 days later. Marcus was at the Billings hardware store buying chicken feed when he ran into Bill Henderson and 2 other local contractors, Dave Mullins and Tom Pritchard. They were discussing a building project near the coffee display. "Marcus," Bill called out, grinning. "Tom here says you never sealed up that attic of yours. That true?" Marcus felt his face flush. "Yeah, I've been looking into it, actually. I think those gaps might be helping with..." "Helping?" Dave interrupted, laughing. "Buddy, you're losing heat in winter and probably getting rain damage. That's not helping anything." Tom shook his head. "I've been building houses for 30 years. Unsealed attics are amateur hour. You should really let a professional fix that before you end up with mold or structural damage." Marcus tried to explain his temperature findings, but the words came out jumbled and defensive. The 3 men exchanged glances, the kind of look that said they were humoring a confused old man. Bill clapped him on the shoulder patronizingly. "Listen, if money's tight, I can help you seal it up myself. Won't charge you much." Marcus mumbled a thank you and left quickly, his earlier confidence shattered. He drove home in silence, their laughter echoing in his mind. That evening, Sarah called. She could hear the defeat in his voice immediately. "Dad, what's wrong?" He told her everything, the heat, his theory about the gaps, the humiliation at the hardware store. There was a long pause. "Dad," Sarah said carefully, "maybe they're right. Maybe you should just let Bill help fix it. You can't keep living like this, pretending everything's fine when it's falling apart." Her words stung more than the contractor's mockery. His own daughter thought he was delusional, clinging to a broken dream. After hanging up, Marcus sat on his porch watching the sunset, feeling utterly alone. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe those gaps were just mistakes, and he was too proud to admit he'd built his cabin wrong. Maybe it was time to accept that his homesteading dream had failed, that he should sell the land and move to some apartment in the city where Sarah could check on him. He looked at his cabin, his life's work, and felt something break inside him. Tomorrow he'd call Bill. He'd let them seal the attic. He'd stop pretending he knew better than actual professionals. Marcus went to bed that night feeling like he'd already given up. Marcus barely slept. At 4 a.m., he gave up trying and made coffee, sitting in the darkness of his kitchen. His phone lay on the table, Bill's number already pulled up, ready to call and surrender. But something stopped him. Pride? Stubbornness? Or maybe just the last flicker of the man who'd once had the courage to leave everything behind and build a life from scratch. Instead of calling Bill, Marcus opened his laptop and searched differently this time. Not just passive cooling or thermal dynamics, but traditional architecture, indigenous building techniques, ancient structures in hot climates. He read about wind towers in Persian architecture, about how Roman villas managed heat, about southwestern adobe homes designed centuries before electricity. Then he found it. A research paper from Montana State University's School of Architecture, published just 8 months ago. The title made his heart race: Vernacular Cooling Methods in Pre-Industrial American Homesteads, The Lost Science of Thermal Chimneys. Marcus read through the night. The paper described exactly what he had: intentional gaps that created a thermal chimney effect. Hot air rose naturally and escaped through upper openings while pulling cooler air from below. The researchers had studied dozens of 19th-century cabins across Montana and Wyoming, finding that many pioneers had used this exact technique. They weren't mistakes. They were solutions. By sunrise, Marcus had printed every page, highlighting passages with shaking hands. He had proof. Scientific proof. Those contractors weren't just wrong. They were ignorant of their own regional history. He grabbed his thermometer and began a systematic test. He measured temperatures at floor level, chest height, and ceiling level throughout the day. The difference was remarkable. While the ceiling reached 91 degrees by afternoon, the floor stayed at 79. The gaps were pulling hot air out constantly, creating circulation that no sealed attic could match. Marcus took photos, recorded videos, documented everything. Then he did something he hadn't done in years. He created a simple blog post on a free website builder. He titled it, "How My Building Mistakes Saved My Summer," and uploaded all his findings, temperatures, and photos. He published it without expectations, just needing to put the truth somewhere. Anywhere. If you're someone who believes in second-guessing the experts, in trusting what you observe over what you're told, then stick with me here. This story is just getting started, and what happens next might change how you think about building, cooling, and trusting your own instincts. Marcus closed his laptop and looked out at his cabin in the morning light. He still didn't know if anyone would believe him. He still felt the sting of that hardware store humiliation. But for the first time in days, he felt something else too. Hope and determination to prove that sometimes the things everyone calls failures are actually quiet victories waiting to be understood. Marcus didn't expect anyone to read his blog post. He'd published it on a Friday afternoon and forgot about it, returning to his daily routine of tending chickens and watering his struggling garden. Monday morning, his phone started buzzing. Emails. Dozens of them. His blog post had been shared on a homesteading forum, then a sustainable architecture group, then a Reddit thread about natural cooling methods. By Tuesday, he'd received over 200 messages. Most were from homesteaders and DIY builders sharing similar experiences. One man in New Mexico wrote, "I've had gaps in my workshop roof for years and everyone said I was lazy. My shop stays 15 degrees cooler than my sealed house." Another woman in Arizona said her grandfather had built his barn the same way in 1952, and it was still the coolest building on their property. But the email that changed everything came Wednesday morning. Dr. Patricia Chen, the lead researcher from that Montana state study, had found his blog. "Mr. Holloway," her email began, "your documentation is extraordinary. You've independently verified exactly what we've been trying to tell modern builders for years. Would you be willing to let our team study your cabin? We're preparing a follow-up paper and your real-world data could be invaluable." Marcus read the email 3 times, certain he'd misunderstood. A university professor wanted to study his cabin, his mistakes, his accidental genius. 2 weeks later, Dr. Chun arrived with 2 graduate students and equipment Marcus didn't recognize. They spent 3 days measuring airflow, documenting temperature differentials, and taking thermal imaging photos. The results were stunning. "Marcus," Dr. Chun said on their final evening, sitting on his porch with printouts spread across the table, "Your cabin is performing 23% more efficiently than comparable sealed structures in heat management. These gaps create a continuous thermal siphon. You've built a passive cooling system that most modern architects have completely forgotten exists." She paused, studying him carefully. "How did you know to do this?" Marcus laughed, the sound catching in his throat. "I didn't know. I just ran out of time and energy to seal them up. Everyone said I'd built it wrong." Dr. Chun shook her head. "You built it exactly right. You just didn't realize it." The following month, Dr. Chun invited Marcus to speak at a sustainable architecture conference in Bozeman. Standing in front of 200 architects, engineers, and builders, Marcus told his story. He showed his photos, his temperature logs, his thermal images. When he finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Then the entire room rose in a standing ovation. Bill Henderson was in the 3rd row. Their eyes met, and Marcus saw something he'd never expected: respect. After the presentation, Bill approached, hand extended. "I was wrong, Marcus. Dead wrong. I'm sorry." Marcus shook his hand. feeling 20 years of doubt finally lift from his shoulders. The months following the conference transformed Marcus's life in ways he never imagined. Dr. Chen's research paper, featuring his cabin as a primary case study, was published in the Journal of Sustainable Architecture and picked up by major building magazines. Suddenly, Marcus Holloway wasn't the stubborn old man with the poorly built cabin. He was a pioneer rediscovering lost wisdom. Requests poured in. Architecture students wanted to visit his property. Sustainable. Building companies asked to feature his cabin in promotional materials. A documentary filmmaker from Seattle spent a week filming his daily routine, capturing how the simple gaps had created a livable space without electricity-dependent cooling. But the most meaningful change was personal. Sarah drove up from Portland in late September, her first visit in over a year. Marcus watched nervously as she walked through the cabin, touching the walls, looking up at the ceiling where those famous gaps resided. "Dad," she said softly, "I owe you an apology. I thought you were being stubborn. I thought you were refusing to admit mistakes. But you were just seeing something nobody else could see." Marcus hugged his daughter, years of tension melting away. She stayed for a week, helping him harvest vegetables and meeting the steady stream of visitors who'd started making pilgrimages to see the cabin in person. Bill Henderson became an unexpected ally. He returned to Marcus's property with genuine curiosity, asking detailed questions about airflow and design. Together, they started a small consulting business, advising homesteaders and small builders on incorporating passive cooling techniques. Bill handled the technical drawings while Marcus shared the practical wisdom he'd accumulated through trial, error, and accidental success. The local hardware store asked Marcus to give a monthly workshop on sustainable building practices. The same place where he'd been humiliated now had his photo on the community board, advertising his classes. Dave Mullins and Tom Pritchard both attended the first session, sitting in the back row, taking notes. Marcus's garden flourished that fall. With the worst heat behind him and his confidence restored, he expanded his vegetable beds, installed rainwater collection systems, and even built a small greenhouse using the same thermal principles. His chickens started laying again, and he began selling eggs at the Billings Farmers Market, where people lined up not just for fresh eggs but to hear stories about the famous cabin. Money was still tight, but Marcus no longer felt the weight of failure pressing down on him. His solar panels powered his essentials, his garden provided food, and his knowledge had become valuable in ways he'd never anticipated. He wasn't rich, but he was respected. He wasn't famous, but he was heard. One cool October evening, Marcus sat on his porch with his journal, adding new sketches and notes. The sunset painted the Beartooth Mountains in shades of orange and purple. Inside his cabin, the temperature was a comfortable 68 degrees. He'd stopped calling them mistakes. Now he called them what they really were, innovations born from necessity, patience, and the courage to trust what he could observe over what he was told. 3 years later, Marcus stood in front of a newly constructed visitor center on his property, watching the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The small building, designed with the same thermal gap principles as his original cabin, would serve as an educational space for the hundreds of people who now visited annually. Sarah stood beside him, now relocated to Billings and working remotely. She'd bought land adjacent to his property and was building her own cabin, with intentional gaps, of course. Her 2 children, Marcus's grandchildren, ran around the property they'd come to love, feeding chickens and checking on tomato plants. The Montana Sustainable Building Institute had awarded Marcus an honorary recognition for contributions to vernacular architecture. His story had been featured in documentaries, podcasts, and even a TED Talk that Dr. Chun had invited him to co-present. But Marcus remained grounded, still living in his original cabin, still growing his vegetables, still waking up to watch sunrises over the mountains. Bill Henderson had become his closest friend. Their consulting business had grown beyond what either expected, helping design over 40 homes across Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. Each one incorporated passive cooling principles, and each one performed remarkably well. Bill often joked that getting humbled by Marcus was the best thing that ever happened to his career. The hardware store where Marcus had once felt so small now sold a pamphlet he'd written, Traditional Cooling Methods for Modern Homesteads. Dave Mullins kept a stack by the register and personally recommended it to every customer. Tom Pritchard had even hired Marcus to redesign the ventilation in his own workshop. But perhaps the most satisfying moment came when a young couple from California visited, desperate for advice. They'd been told their self-built home was full of mistakes, that they'd need to spend $30,000 to fix everything. Marcus walked through their property, examined their accidental design choices, and smiled. "You don't need to fix anything," he told them. "You need to understand what you've built." He spent 3 hours teaching them about airflow, thermal dynamics, and trusting their observations. When they left, the woman was crying with relief. The man shook Marcus's hand for a long time, unable to find words. That evening, Marcus sat on his porch with Sarah, watching his grandchildren chase fireflies in the twilight. His cabin, once a source of shame, had become a landmark. His mistakes had become a methodology. His stubbornness had become wisdom. Thank you for staying with this story until the very end. If it resonated with you, if it made you think differently about failure, expertise, or trusting your own observations, I'd be grateful if you take a moment to like this video, leave a comment about a time you trusted yourself over the experts, and subscribe to the channel. Share your own stories. I read every single comment. What topic should we explore next? Your suggestions shape everything we create here. Marcus Holloway proved that sometimes the things the world calls failures are just successes nobody understood yet. And that's a lesson worth remembering.